Fellow students of Teaching the Exceptional Learner, my name is Jacqueline Zeter, and today's presentation will be on using peer revision in high school classrooms. Peer revision is an evidence-based practice utilized for proofreading written assignments. As evidenced by the name, it uses partner work to improve writing. This practice is far from limited to editing papers, however, as any writing in any class can certainly be improved upon. While it may seem like everyone has done peer revision at some point, think back to your middle school and high school years. In which classes did you have a specified time for peer review? How was it formatted? If you teach in any subject now, do you already use this practice in your classroom? For which assignments? Take a moment to pause this presentation and jot down an answer to these questions. All of us should have done peer revision at some point in our schooling, because research supporting the use of peer revision in the classroom dates back to two studies that were done in the early 1990s by MacArthur and Englert, who saw improved academic outcomes for both students with disabilities in addition to those students without disabilities. More recently, a 2014 study by Margot Mastio-Pieri and Thomas Scruggs found peer revision is specifically implicated in helping close achievement gaps between students with and without disabilities across multiple writing genres. With the emphasis some schools put on writing across curriculums, it's good to note that this practice is effective with different forms of writing and not just essay papers. Children with emotional and behavioral disorders have particularly good academic outcomes when this practice is utilized, with multiple studies showing increased time on task and increased generation of quality ideas during writing. Writing quality improvements. These studies also showed that there are strong social outcomes for students with emotional and behavioral disorders when peer revision is used. These outcomes can include increased behavior regulation when working with peers outside the mandated classroom peer work time. In order for peer revision to be optimally successful, however, students need explicit instruction both in grammar revision standards and in how to give constructive criticism. In a meta-analysis of over 40 studies by Gillespie and Graham in 2014, it is even suggested that peer revision is ineffective when not taught explicitly. As a quick reminder, here are the general steps of explicit instruction. I do, we do, and you do. This should be familiar to you as it is the most effective means of introducing new material. In I do, the teacher demonstrates. In we do, the project is done as a group. In you do, the students do the assignment independently. Now, go back to the answers you jotted down before. Hopefully you listed more than just English class as having used peer revision. If you can think back, make a note of how many of the classes you listed actually taught you explicitly what you should do when revising a written assignment. If you teach, how often do you explicitly give the instructions for peer review? Make a note of this after pausing the video. So how do we teach peer revision explicitly? There are 5 overlying steps which follow a general 3-step model for explicit instruction. We will go over them in detail now. First, you need to develop background knowledge of what good writing looks like in your content area. The term good writing is subjective when looking at different topics. For example, science writing is heavily based on interconnection of ideas, on claims and evidence, which is different from a nonfiction novel or from a biography. Start with an example of good writing. You, the teacher, should pull out the important elements of writing and present them to the student. For example, if you are giving a lab report as your assignment, you should pull out the important elements of each segment of a lab report, including abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussion, and conclusion. This is like your I do step. Find examples and non-examples of good writing for each section. Make sure you check for understanding as you go over this. You don't want to move on if the class is not sure what you've taught them, if they cannot identify good writing. Once good writing has been established, you would next model questions to consider while revising a written article. This portion should focus on the teacher assessing the content and whether or not it makes sense, as well as teaching exactly how to give constructive criticism. This is a continuation of the I do step of explicit instruction. The questions you model should be provided to your students. Giving students a worksheet of some kind can be helpful for this, and it gives them something concrete to refer back to when they get to the independent practice. There are many sample worksheets that can be found simply by doing a Google search of peer-reviewed checklists. Pause this presentation and find one that you like, or view the sample questions I have provided on the screen. If you teach, what would you add to this list? If you do not teach, which of these things would be most helpful to you? Once students identify the important parts of good writing, you need to spend some time teaching grammar revision symbols. The teacher should model a full I do of these rules, using examples and non-examples to show when to use and not to use a symbol, before transitioning to a we do practice of the symbols. Whether or not students should have had this instruction in an English class does not make this step unnecessary. During the explicit instruction of symbols, make sure you give students many opportunities to respond, whether this is through the high-tech means of websites like Socrative or low-tech whiteboards and response cards. These are concrete symbols, yes or no, right or wrong. They're not exactly open to interpretation like other parts of peer revision can be. They have to be memorized correctly for successful revision to take place. Otherwise, the author of the paper who they are revising will not know what corrections need to be made. At this point, you will have introduced, explained, and modeled how to revise a document for your students. How much time this takes will depend on your class's age, discipline, and present level of knowledge. Pause this presentation and look back on your responses from earlier. In which of the classes you've done peer revision in did you receive this level of modeling? If you are a teacher, have you ever gone over these steps this in depth in your own classroom? If the answer is no, it is likely this practice is not being implemented effectively. What can you change? If your students appear to have fully grasped both what good writing looks like and the mechanics of grammar revision, you're ready to practice. You can recognize this as your we do element of the explicit instruction of peer revision. Give all students the same sample document. First, as a whole group, then later in small groups or pairs, read through the document and practice giving constructive criticism as well as using the revision symbols. This can vary in difficulty based on the age of your students and their mastery level in the beginning parts. Group practice time should be extensive, and it can span more than one class period if it needs to. It is important that your students are adept at using the tools they've been given before revising anything a peer has written. Again, make sure your students have plenty of opportunities to respond so that you can be confident they know what they're doing before they get their hands on another person's work. Once you're sure students are competent in the process, have them revise their own draft. It is likely some of the background you established on good writing wasn't known before the assignment was completed. This is the you do of explicit instruction. After students revise their papers on their own, have them swap papers with an assigned partner to further revise. This can be done in the same class period with the same draft they revised, or you can allow the student to make changes and bring a new draft to the next class. While practice was mostly done in groups, revision of a draft should be individual, with feedback provided to the author after it has been completed. This is where your students can pull out that checklist you gave them at step 2. When we do things like peer revision, it is likely we have also asked for the student to give a copy of the document to us, the teacher. Remember that revised draft should be graded based on whether and how the students implemented the revisions from the prior draft. If a student was penalized for something on the first draft and did not make a correction, they should not be doubly penalized. Having broken down this teaching process for peer revision into steps, how do you plan to incorporate peer revision in your classroom? Take a moment and compare this to the other processes that you had throughout your education. What are you going to change? Thank you for your thoughtful attention to this presentation.